Hi, I'm Heather from here booktubes, and today's the spoiler-free and spoiler sections for Thickest Thieves, which is the 5th book in the Queen's Thief series by Megan Whalen Turner. This is my all-time favorite young adult fantasy series. It's political fantasy, and we're following the struggles of a small peninsula with 3 tiny independent countries against an empire that is looking to colonize them. And we specifically follow this intercontinental struggle through the thief who, when we first meet him, is a young teenager who claims that he can steal anything, and we follow him on a journey in the first book, right? So this is the 5th book. We are following a minor side character from the 3rd book that we saw mentioned a couple of times, and that was really it. We are following a slave of the Mede Empire, and specifically we are following him after disaster has befell him, and he is now a runaway slave with an Anatolian soldier, and they are trying to make their way out of the empire. And he is hiding things from the soldier is hiding things from him, but the soldier's main goal is to get this slave to Atolia, and the slave's main goal is to not die. This is a very well-educated slave, a very valuable slave who is high up in his household and in the affairs of the kingdom, and he is our narrator. So we are seeing the entire journey through his eyes and the information that he has and knows. And I really love this one. It's such a fast read. I feel like it's so quick. It really just flies by, and he is a very interesting character. I like seeing his judgments and his prejudices and his assumptions about things. I like seeing his knowledge and just, his lived experience and what that has led him to draw conclusions from. He's incredibly intelligent. He's a kind soul as much as he can be, and just a character I really enjoy following. Those are all of the things that I can tell you about this book. It's very interwoven into the final plays of the series. The next book is the finale of the series, so we're really drawing to a conclusion here, and this is a valuable piece of the story that you wouldn't have even considered being a piece, I don't think, and yet here we are, and it really is kind of a linchpin, right, that makes things happen that perhaps could not have been foreseen otherwise. So a fascinating entry, one that I personally really enjoy, and is one I've been looking forward to. So it's a good time. Now for the spoiler section of this book, and we will be using my Kindle highlights to talk about it. All right, so we have Kemet, right? And we've seen him with Nahusarish before. We've seen him in the 3rd book, and we know that he is very valuable to his master, and we know that he is kind of part of the intelligence network in some ways. He's definitely someone with a lot of information and someone who knows all about the affairs of his entire household and Nahusarish's correspondence and his network and who he knows, the different players in the politics of the empire, because Nahusarish is the emperor's nephew, and I think the future emperor's brother. So right at the beginning of the highlights, I have my master fighting with his wife the entire time. She had been unsurprisingly unenthusiastic about his attempts to marry the Anatolian queen. That little nugget is hilarious to me. Right at the beginning, he's been beaten for mistakenly offering him congratulations for a post that he had sought out. Everything that he knew would have predicted that Nahusarish, despite being out of favor, would have easily qualified for that post, and so he was surprised that he was denied. And we know that Kemet can go in and out of the palace, and we also know he has very poor eyesight from so much time spent over ledgers and scrolls by candlelight. In fact, if my eyesight had been better, the whole course of this narrative might have been different. I would have seen the Anatolian waiting ahead of me in an empty hallway of the palace. Met, said the Aetolian with a firm nod of greeting. This was growing worse and worse. My king blames your master for the loss of his hand. My king wants your master to suffer the loss of his right hand. He was speaking metaphorically. He meant me. I was my master's right hand. The Aetolian king obviously had a deep well of spite, and I would have appreciated his low cunning more if I hadn't thought the Aetolian was about to wring my neck. And we see that the Aetolian is talking heavily accent Mede. He could have just spoken in Aetolian, but instead he used very simple sentences. It was like being lectured by an earnest, oversized child. I could read and write in most of the significant languages of the empire. My master had paid good money for it to be so. Someday he meant to make a gift of me to his brother, and then, as the next emperor's personal slave, I would be one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in all of the empire. I wouldn't have taken the Aetolian's offer even if I believed it was sincere. And then Layla comes and tells Kemet that Nahusrash is dead and tells him to save himself because there were only two men who could have poisoned my master, his brother or the emperor himself. When a man is murdered, his slaves are tortured. If any confess, then all are executed, whether they share in the guilt or not. No one will buy them, and they can hardly be freed. What a temptation that would put before the enslaved population. In the case of a poisoning, where the administration of the poison is unclear, the slaves are put to death on principle. The Medes fear little in quite the same way as they fear a slave uprising. And this torture starts with the secretary, which is Kemet. If a slave implicates another in his confession, the rest of the slaves will be fiercely interrogated as well. But if not, there may be no torture for the others, just death. After the recent beating, I would be doubly suspect, and if anyone had seen Layla warning me, she would be in greater danger as well. That it was the emperor who was guilty, that everyone would know it, changed nothing. We would be arrested and tortured, not just into confessing, but also implicating our fellow slaves. None of them could leave the emperor's palace. Of all my master's slaves, only I had the privilege. The only thing I could do for them was go. If I escaped, blame might fall on me alone. A chance to die quickly instead of slowly was all I could give them, so I walked on. I had nowhere to go. I needed to leave the city, but I could think of no way out. Turning away from the water, I found myself nose to chest with the Aetolian. And of course, the Aetolian doesn't know that Nahusrash is dead. Only Kemet knows that. So he's hiding that from the Aetolian. We see that the only reason why Kemet goes with the Aetolian is that he's really just completely out of options, and his hand is forced not only by the incentive of his definite death, but also the torture and death of his fellow slaves, which he wants to try and make that as easy as possible. These are the only things that have motivated him to go with the Aetolian, right? And he still doesn't even really want to go with the Aetolian, but it's the only option he really has, and he doesn't know how to get away from the Aetolian. And he fully plans on escaping the entire book, right? At no point in the book is he just like, oh, I'm just going to go to Aetolia and everything is going to be fine. He's sure that the Aetolians are going to kill him, or if they don't kill him, that they can't keep the Mede from killing him. And he has every intention of escaping and vanishing if he sees a chance. Then he's talking about the Aetolian. If there was not much intelligence in his features, there was no sign of cruelty either. He was large, as I already knew, and a soldier. I had no doubt he was good at what he did. He rather reminded one of an ox. Very strong, not terribly quick, but I thought killing was his work, not his pleasure. His king trusted him at a long distance, but stealing someone else's slave was not what I would call a prestigious task. Although I couldn't be certain, the king himself was a thief, so what did I know about what he valued? I woke to find I had not been murdered in my sleep. The Aetolians are for the most part uneducated, and Kemet really looks down on them for that, right? He really values his education. It's something that sets him apart from those around him. And he's grown up in the empire, and he values the empire's arts and literature and all of that. As the churning sense of terror and dislocation faded, my sense of superiority was slowly reasserting itself. Clutching at him, I gasped, I can't swim, I can't swim. First in Mede and then in Aetolian. I would be more proud of my ability to translate during such crisis if the Aetolian hadn't calmly suggested I stand up. The water came only to my chin, not even to his shoulder. Good thing it isn't deeper, he observed. If he had previously displayed any sense of humor, I would have suspected him of laughing at me. The boat that they were on catches on fire, they go into the river, they escape. Well, said the Aetolian, that is all of my king's money gone. But he does have his slave chain, which is solid gold. Removing the chain from another man's slave is a crime. More so than stealing him? The Aetolian asked incredulously. Yes, I said curtly. This was not the place or time to explain that stealing a man's property was one crime, and freeing his slave was another, only the second punishable by death. The first was theft, while the other was disturbing the order of the empire. The Aetolian waited, far and away the most eloquent non-speaker I think I have ever known. And that's how I became a caravan guard. He had an open face and an honest one, and I'd mistaken that for stupidity. He was not a liar by nature, certainly, but he was not the fool I had taken him for. So they're on this caravan for a few days, doing guard duty, and then the Namreen, the emperor's handpicked bodyguards, are chasing them. They had no idea why. And the Aetolian kills one that almost killed Kemet. The Aetolian said, sounding puzzled but not angry, why didn't you gut him? He had no guard up at all. Sitting up, I stared at the dead man lying in front of me while trying to blink the wetness from my eyes. It was my blood, I realized. Do you know, I said in a strangled whisper, do you know what happens to a slave who arms himself in the empire? Do you have any idea what they do to slaves who even look for too long at a sword or a dagger or anything more dangerous than a penknife? Do you have any idea, you imbecile, what they do? My voice seemed to be getting higher and higher as I repeated myself. The Aetolian dropped his sword in the dirt beside the dead Marine and pulled me into his arms. I just called him an imbecile. I was sure he was going to kill me with his bare hands. I struggled but couldn't get free. He only squeezed tighter. Kemet, the Aetolian said quietly in my ear, and we'll be all right. Don't be afraid, Kemet. I wouldn't tell you this if it weren't true. I swear to you, I'm not going to leave your dead body beside the road to Perth. I didn't come all the way to this godforsaken cesspit so I could go home and tell my king I failed him. Suddenly, so chatty, I thought, and what was he calling a cesspit? Aetolia, that was a cesspit. A backward, savage, stinking hole in the ground. I knew because I'd been there. They couldn't read. Why Namreen, he wondered aloud. Why send the emperor's bodyguard after an escaped slave? It makes no sense, said the Aetolian, slowly shaking his head. He wasn't as stupid as I thought. My only hope was to continue to deceive him. So Kemet is convinced that the Namreen are following him because his master is dead, right? Nahusharesh. Again, very important player, albeit in disgrace. He's basically royalty. Right. It's because I'm so valuable. I was to be a gift to the new emperor, so my disappearance was an insult to him as well. Do you know what I'm worth? I asked. At my price, the Aetolian's eyebrows went up. I thought that would distract him. Perhaps your king did not know. The Aetolian shrugged. No one knows. So something has happened with the Kindle. The Goodreads updates. Kill me now. But apparently it's not showing the full highlight if you highlight a bunch. What is the purpose of this? Do you think I'm plagiarizing? I'm highlighting. You're supposed to be here so I can read. But anyways, the Aetolian says no one knows what my king knows, basically. And they hide in the lion's cave, which the lion is still actively using, and the Aetolian is able to hold off the lion. No one will look for us here, he said defensively. The lion will, I said. And then the men come with a dog to track them down, but the lion is still there, and so they think that the dogs have been following the lioness, and the lioness chases them away. First, tell me, how did you come to the place? And he misunderstood. With a tilt of his head and a wince, he said, I punched the king in the face. Which lets us know who our Aetolian is. Good old Costas. My king, said the Aetolian with a very serious expression, likes to pretend that he doesn't recognize the Mede ambassador. Whenever they meet, the ambassador has to introduce himself with all of his diplomatic titles and his qualifications. No, yes. And when I stared aghast at this juvenile and frankly rude behavior in a head of state, he added, sometimes twice a day. You lie. Then they're escaping, they're going over mountains and stuff. Kemet tells him about a kitchen boy that he had made friends with when he was in Aetolia. He said he had run away before and meant to try again. He said the palace guard had hunted him down the first time. Then they go to the mill. They get in the fight. Kemet gets the rotten flour all over them. Costas falls into a well with the dog and is dead, as far as Kemet knows. Kemet is very conflicted because he always meant to leave the Atolian, right? He was never going to Atolia. He was always looking for an escape, and he's sure that he's dead. And then this mysterious wine merchant comes, basically, that he's already run into a couple of times, and I think that you can definitely lift from the context clues that this is another act of the gods, that this is the man from the stories, which, by the way, the mythology between Atolia and then the style of the Mead stories, I think it's very interesting. Megan Whalen Turner made this so distinctively different, and I think that that makes sense for different countries and different cultures, right? But so I think that you can easily say that that is actually the man from the stories, because again, one of the things that I like about this is Eugenides is so clever. He is truly just a force to be reckoned with, but he is not the only force to be reckoned with. He cannot single-handedly change the course of an empire. He is certainly the man for the job, but he is not the only person working towards this aim. Not only does he have his queen and the Magus and Relius and, you know, just so many people who he would not be able to replace. He would not be able to just do without them. But also you do have the gods acting, I believe, to protect the peninsula. I think that that is a real theme of the story. And he says that the Atolian wasn't even his friend. And then the wine merchant says, if you are wrong about whether he is a friend, perhaps you are wrong as well about whether he is gone. Sometimes we mistake these things. Be certain before you let go of him. I once was lost and my friend came for me. So even though Kemet thinks that he literally can't accomplish anything, he's sure the Atolian's dead, he turns around and goes back. It's nighttime. He's trying to check the well to see if the Atolian is dead, and he gets a splinter and he starts cursing. Kemet, said a quiet voice from below. I nearly jumped down my skin and then froze, not sure if it was the Atolian or the ghost of him that spoke. You're alive? I whispered. Of course I'm alive, he said, sounding peeved. Well, why didn't you say something? I just did. I meant before I stuck myself with a splinter like an awl. Maybe because I thought you were the miller, you idiot. Oh, you were expecting him to sneak into his own mill yard in the middle of the night? I didn't know why I was so angry. Kemet, said the Atolian patiently, stop arguing, please, and get me out of here. Then the miller surprises Kemet and attacks him. He's dead, the miller snarled. You can't have him. Intent on hitting me with his club, he had turned his back on the well. He didn't see the Atolian rising out of it like a mechanical god in a stage play, shining whites in the moonlight. Oh dear gods, I thought. He really was dead. My stark terror must have been obvious because the miller whirled to face the apparition. Just for a moment we stood frozen, the ghostly Atolian, the miller, and me. Then the club dropped from the miller's nerveless fingers and he produced a thin whistling sound like a wounded toddler without the breath to scream. He runs away. And then he figures out that it's because he looks like a ghost with all the flowers still stuck to him. And then he starts making ghost noises. And they are cracking themselves up while trying to escape. So then they're walking and the Atolian appears to not be doing great. I'm fine, said the Atolian again, more curtly. Then he seemed to rethink. Actually, he said, I'm inches from death from a putrid sore throat, and you should leave me in the nearest ditch. What? I was mystified. If I wouldn't leave you in a well, why would I abandon you in a ditch? He looked momentarily as confused as I felt. I don't know, he admitted. I was just trying to stop you from worrying, and I've seen someone else do it that way. The Atolian trade house is closed because of the plague. So they had been trying to get to there. Now their destination is useless. There's nobody there. And then they're looking for Atolian ships, but there aren't any Atolian ships. And then they find a little ship further out that has an Atolian captain. The Atolian pulled the ring from his ear and held it out. This is the private seal of Atolus Eugenides, he said. Well, thank the eternal gods he hadn't swallowed it when he put it in his mouth when they had the slave traders, and Kemet kicked him in the balls to try and keep him from blowing everything. We need passage home, said the Atolian. Our king will pay you well. The captain rolled his eyes. Well enough to compensate me for the loss of trade on a 6-month trip, he asked, not believing it. The Aetolian nodded. I was quite impressed with his air of command, even more impressed because he was still pale from illness, and he was all dirty and stuff, but he still is able to pull it off. The captain hesitated, locking eyes with the Aetolian. He weighed the dangers of failing us if what the Aetolian said was true. And all of this, Kemet is still planning on escaping. He does not want to go on the ship to Aetolia. I did not want to leave the Aetolian, but once he knew of my master's death, our brief friendship would be over. He might hear the rumors, and he would certainly know the truth when we reached Aetolia. I could not accompany him there, no matter what. I'd made a fool of a ruler so petty he'd stolen another man's slave for spite. So profligate? Have I ever said that word out loud? I don't think so. He'd waste the profits of a 6-month trading trip to have what he wanted. He wasn't going to free me and might well kill me for it. Again, I was taken by surprise by his confidence and his air of command. This is talking about the Aetolian. That he was more sure of himself in his native tongue was one explanation, but I think it was also the effect of the king's seal. When he held it in his hand, he did not doubt that he spoke for the king and that the king's authority was incontestable. Anyone could see in his face, and I think his respect for that trivially small carved stone more than anything else persuaded the captain. Or perhaps it was just the obverse side of being such a terrible liar. His honesty was easy to believe in. So the Aetolian goes to the Aetolian trade house at the next city that they've taken the ship to present the king's seal. When the king took the throne, the imprint of that seal had been sent out on documents everywhere the Aetolians traded. Unlike the public seals, only a handful of people would have seen it at each house, but it would have been carefully stored for just such occasions as this one. So then, while the Aetolian's there, Kemet tries to escape, and this city has winding streets that bring you back to the docks to try and thwart pirate raids, right? Twice I found myself back at the docks where I had started, as if the gods had cursed my wandering feet. I had my head down, berating myself for an idiot, and I looked up only moments before crashing straight into the Aetolian standing amused in front of me. The captain, the Aetolian, and I walked back to the docks. The curving streets led us right to our ship as though the gods themselves had paved our way. So on the ship, Kemet is praying and begging gods to not let the ship go to Aetolia, anywhere but Aetolia. I would have thrown myself overboard into the sea if I'd thought it would have kept the Aetolian from ever knowing that I had betrayed him. And I prayed to the God of justice that punishment for my deceit would fall on my shoulders, not his. At night, I lay awake thinking about what the Aetolian king might do. So then they get to Aetolia and they are greeted by warships. And he ends up confessing to the Aetolian that his master is dead. And every single thing that he had noticed, he was reevaluating. He nodded slowly. I thought we were Immakuk and Ennekar, but we were just Cenobed and his master, weren't we? His words were more full of contempt for himself than for me. Is that why you didn't want to tell me those jokes? You were afraid I'd see myself in them? No, I protested. No, he agreed. I wouldn't have. I'm that stupid. The soldiers came up over the railing, so many to collect just the two of us, their numbers proportional to the rage of a confounded king. If you had told me, he said, I would have let you go. And it's Teleus, and he's here to arrest you in the name of the king. This time the Aetolian did shout, What? Think you idiot, said his captain. They get arrested, they're taken to the palace, everything's really quiet, and the guards are not really monitoring them, they're monitoring for threats. Where is everyone? The Aetolian asked. Silence, said the leader of our cohort. The queen, someone said under his breath. Miscarried, the man beside me whispered. A son, I heard, said another. So we learned of the heir just as he slipped away. His sex might have been only a rumor and a reflection of the longed-for security an heir would have brought to the country. But talk of it meant the pregnancy had been far along. The queen was old for her first child, and late miscarriages were often deadly. The Aetolians might lose her yet. Costas, I said, using his name for the first time since he had told it to me on board the riverboat at the start of our journey. Costas, I'm sorry. They're in the prison cells for safety. He refused to concede, but it would have been difficult, if not impossible, to refute the pettiness of Eugenides. Costas could only mother, "That's not true. He had so much faith in his silly king." I listened. I knew all I needed of the king of the Aetolians. He was so incompetent, he couldn't stop his servants from dumping sand on his food. He was so careless of the lives of his servants that he exiled Costas when he couldn't protect him. So careless of my life that he thought I would come like a dog to his hand when he sent for me. Like Nahushresh, he cared only about what he wanted, and to hell with anyone else. I knew what men with power were like, even if Costas didn't. "One of us is an idiot," I said. "I don't think it's me." The king would have an audience, and they'd come to see him, hoping for news of their queen. How appalled they must be to think that their queen might die, and they might be left with the thief of Eddis as their sovereign. Then the king entered the room. I couldn't see him at first, but I knew someone had arrived, because every head turned in his direction, and words died on every lip. Kemet couldn't really see him, but the strength of his personality was apparent, reflected in the undivided attention of every single person in the room. Great Annette, I thought. I had been deceived, and I looked over at Costas in amazement, because it was he who had deceived me. This was not the weak and silly man he had described. This was not the king of the Aetolians they talked about in the empire. This was a man who held his court in thrall, as if he were the emperor himself. "The queen lives and will be well," said the king, and everyone breathed again, grateful to receive the blessing of their gods, but not because they would have abandoned Eugenides if she had died. No, they feared the worst because they cared for her. He was their sovereign as much as she. I could not doubt it. "Oh, my Costas," I thought. "Oh, my friend." I turned to him, panic filling my heart, because he was as solid and unflappable as ever, and he was an idiot. Never in all of his stories of the king had he shown me this man sitting on the dais. This man who had seized the throne and in so short a time made it indisputably his own. I'd counted on the fact that Costas was the favorite of a weak and petty man, that the king who had forgiven him once would forgive him again, and that any consequences of the king's anger would fall on me alone. But powerful men like this had no patience for those who disappointed them. I looked at Costas and only in that moment recognized, to my horror, that the expression on his face was not anger, but stubbornness. He meant to lie to his king. He would try to conceal my master's death, sure that the king would free me, and I could flee before the king learned he had been deceived. "Great king," I said, turning away from him, shouting toward the far end of the room, struggling to advance. Hastily assembling in my head a story to persuade the king of Aetolians that I had left the empire for no other reason than a desire to serve him. "Kemet," he spoke with such familiarity, as if we were friends meeting at a wine shop, that I paused in my generation of my narrative and raised my head. I must have looked like a Kagaj checking for a hawk. "I'm reluctant," said the king slowly, studying his boots as if they were a surprise there on the end of his legs, and wriggling one as if checking its polish before starting again. "I'm reluctant to incur the wrath of the gods by claiming that a man lives when they may take any of us at their pleasure, but I believe that Nahushresh is in perfect health." I couldn't imagine what he meant. The king shifted on his throne. "It is my fault. Let neither of us blame Costas." And then the king confesses that he had ordered Layla to tell him that, and that they didn't tell Costas because they were misdirecting Hammett. There had been no one to support or contradict her story. We had been alone, but it was impossible. It was absolutely impossible. Why would Layla lie? Because I had believed in her. I had trusted her. I left the palace in a panic on the basis of nothing but her word. She had lied. I could feel my heart breaking. When only she could have betrayed me, she had. Layla, I thought, why? "You would not have left Nahushresh otherwise," said the king. And that was true, because he was going to be a very powerful man. He was going to help run an empire. And instead, he'd been played for a fool. "Kemet, she did it so that you could be free, as I knew she would, because you told me so much about her." "Never." I finally looked up. I had never spoken to the king. "I know you don't see well, but I thought you would remember my voice." So he gets close enough to actually see his face. Sat leaning forward so that I could get a good look at the Queen of Aetolia's errand boy and sandal polisher. "Do they know?" I asked, gesturing toward all the courtiers behind me. "Some," he said seriously. "More will know now." I found him taller, broader in the shoulder, much older than the intervening years would explain, with the hook where his hand had been, wholly changed. Perhaps he was only by accident at the edge of this court and had slowly and inevitably drawn all of it into orbit around him. Kemet asks why, and Eugenides says, spite. I have a great deal of ill will for your former master, and because you are my friend. The disobedient servant I'd found endearing in the king who'd stolen my future, I struggled to put the two people together in my head. Costas' stories of a weak and silly king, and the confident and cunning manipulator before me. Like misaligned papers, he couldn't get it to match up. Then Kemet runs into the mean ambassador. His Majesty's interest is unaccountable, the ambassador was saying. It was. A weaker, more foolish king might have stolen me away from my master for spite, but not the man I just seen on the throne. A less ruthless man might have done it out of kindness, but Eugenides had dismissed that justification. The king does enjoy his little jokes, I said. There was a subtext to this conversation that I was missing. Whatever it was, I felt very strongly that I didn't want to talk to the meat ambassador anymore. Then he is given his master's old guest suite at the palace, and he ends up crying and going to sleep. And then when he wakes up, the king of Aetolia is sitting at the end of his bed. It wasn't spite or friendship, I said, glancing sideways at the king. It wasn't just spite or friendship, he said, though I hope you will believe that both played their part. He also has one of the ambassadors for one of the countries of the greater powers, which is the opposition of the Mede Empire, and the thing that they need to convince that the Mede is serious in order to help protect them. The emperor is preparing an army to attack our little peninsula. I nodded. Everyone knew that. Everyone knows that, prompted the king, as if, like Costas, he could read my thoughts. I nodded again. Yes, the king looked significantly at the ambassador. But the greater powers are busy and they won't do anything without proof. And by then it will be too late for little Aetolia, little Elis, and little Sunis. The king pinched his finger and thumb together under no illusion as to their significance in the conflict between the continent and the Medes. Little countries get eaten up by bigger countries or crushed between them. My queen believes the emperor cannot bring his army against us without ships. Many ships. He amasses his navy, moving in secret to avoid open confrontation and hoping to take the continent by surprise. If the Allied navy came face to face with those ships, no one could ignore the threat they represent. We need the Allies to see that fleet, Kemet. The king leaned toward me. Where is the navy? This was why I had been brought from the Empire, and this was why the Nemrine had hunted us so relentlessly, not because Nahusresh had been murdered, but because the Emperor feared I could tell the king of Aetolia where he was hiding. But it was all for nothing. I didn't know. And then he starts thinking about it, and he says, Hemsha. Hemsha had been such a humble request for my proud master to make of the Emperor to be governor of an undeveloped coastal province. I remembered my relief that he hadn't been overreaching as he often did, and my mistaken certainty that he would be successful. Overconfidence that had certainly cost me dearly. If Nahusresh was not dead, if he hadn't sunk so low in the emperor's graces as to be poisoned by his own brother, why then hadn't he been made governor of Hemsha? More certain by the moment, I told the king, Hemsha has only a tiny port. There's a protected strait, so you can have a whole bunch of ships there, but it's not really effective as a port, so it's not busy. And he also mentions the spies at one of the forts that are willing to betray, and so he basically tells them exactly what it is, and he knows about that because he had burned the correspondence before they escaped Aetolia the first time. Thank you, Kemet. He continued to sit cross-legged at the foot of the bed a little longer, assuring me that I would be safe in the palace. And you needn't worry about something being slipped into your dinner. I had a little talk with the kitchen staff last night, so happily neither will I. So then Maharet is going to try and tell the Mede Empire that the king of Aetolia is going to come for their navy, but it's unlikely he's going to be believed, right? A month or so later, an allied fleet sailed into the narrow bay north of Hemsha, looking for a stream to refill their water barrels, and found instead the ships of the Emperor's navy neatly lined up at their moorings. Alarmed, an unknown gunner fires, and the smaller navy of the Allies ends up destroying the Emperor's navy. And the admiral of the Allied fleet wrote a very regretful report calling it an untoward accident. Rumor had it that Eugenides stole the report from the diplomatic correspondence and read it out loud to his queen. And the Aetolians like to point out that you couldn't tell that the king of Aetolia had done anything. There was nothing to connect him to this regrettable debacle. And then Aurelius comes to talk to Kemet, and he tells him that he should trust the king. Aurelius says he's very tender-hearted. He'll feel quite bad about it as he cuts you up into little pieces and feeds you to wolves. I myself would walk across hot coals for him. The Aurelius I had known had been fanatically loyal to his queen, for either of them, he added. I didn't trust Eugenides. I trusted my judgment of Aurelius. What is it that you would like to know? And Kemet has an incredible knowledge because, again, he was going to literally help run the empire. So he's a pretty good resource. Aurelius wanted a written record of my flight from the empire, so I began this narrative in the palace of Aetolia, but have only recently neared its completion. So he's being sent away for his safety, and also he's being sent to where there are many rare scrolls that he would like to translate, and so the king is giving him his dream job. But also it's at a specific point where they could really use a lookout, and then Costas, who he had thought he'd lost his friendship with, is coming with him. I saw the queen resting in the garden, and Aetolia's request was my command. Aetolia lay on a couch that had been carried out from the palace, her beauty heightened by an unsettling frailty. She was obviously ill, but her vulnerability only emphasized the nature of her power. It was neither her beauty nor her physical strength that made her queen. She asked, "Is it true, Kemet, that my king twice bit my head cook?" I nodded and said gravely, "Indeed, your majesty, I witnessed it with my own eyes," back when he was posing as a servant. She murmured, "Anything worth doing is worth overdoing, it seems," and I ducked my head to hide my own smile. It was a most apt summation of the king's behavior. I knew by then that there was far more affection between the monarchs than I would have believed possible before my arrival in Aetolia. They have a saying, "The river knows its time." The queen looked down at her hands. It was not her time. We will welcome her when she comes again. And then Kemet is talking to Eugenides, and he says, "Why send Costas? He's honest, not stupid," the king pointed out. "No, of course not. That's not what I meant." "You would have eluded a man with twice his cunning," said the king. That was probably true. So again, we see that a tiny little piece, a person that perhaps others wouldn't have viewed as important or who was underestimated, is going to be the thing that turns the tides. And I just find the way that the politics of the series are interwoven, and specifically how each little thing can make such a big difference in the outcome. I find that to be probably my favorite part. Just a fascinating look into the inner workings of empires. Meade had recalled his diplomats from Aetolia. Melhart was not looking forward to his homecoming. The imperial fleet should have been moved, no matter how adamantly the emperor's nephew had insisted that his slave could not know its location. Melhart had said as much as delicately as he could, knowing he risked offending people far more powerful than he was. Melhart had been right and they had been wrong, and that was far more dangerous to Melhart than the reverse. And then there's this figurine that is missing the right hand that the king of Aetolia had asked the ambassador for a bunch of times, and then they're on the boat, the ambassador is leaving, and the servant says that it's gone. Melhart would have sworn on his life that the figurine had been impossible to steal, but the king of Aetolia was still the thief of Eddis. It was Melhart's unfortunate task to persuade his emperor that the king of Aetolia was a threat. The servant retired below decks to the ambassador's cabin, where he locked the door and opened the case that held the statue. It was a lovely thing, the god, at once graceful and strong, stern but kind. Even the ragged edge where the hand had been broken off to appease the gods did not really mar its beauty. Ansel opened the porthole. It was a shame, really, but the Aetolian king paid well, and he was a dangerous man to cross. Ansel dropped the statue into the sea. I think that is so funny because it shows that the myth, the legend, the impression is more important to the king than actually stealing the thing, right? He just bribed the servant into getting rid of it. He never actually stole it. And I feel like that's something that someone has to be able to laugh at themselves in order to be able to do. So that's it for the spoilers for this book. I have a brief spoiler for the last book of the series. So spoilers for the series, spoiler for the last book. Our last book, we have the perspective of a child, right? And we see kind of the results of that here. I saw the youngest attendant of the king wrestling with his lessons. He had a pugnacious self-reliance that was unusual in such a body, and I suspected he was trying his tutor in knots. The young Arondites. Dun, 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 dun. And then he's talking to the king, and he says, "Your Majesty, your youngest attendant needs a better tutor." "Thank you, Kemet," said the king. "I'll look into it." And then he was gone. Dear Aurelius, forgive the briefness of this note. We have arrived as expected and are settling in. Costas acquires a reputation as a naturalist hiking the surrounding hills all day, bringing home grubby specimens to fill the house. I think he's beginning to like them. He has mapped most of the observation points he was looking for. There are a number of scrolls here that I've never seen before. I cannot help suspecting the king of knowing about them all along. To your new student, who I have no doubt opened this private message, my greetings, and you should not have done so. It was very wrong. Be sure you use the smaller brass straight edge, the one that hangs next to the armillary sphere, and press the seams in the paper when you refold it so that they are crisp, and Aurelius will not know right away what you have done. But that's it. Next one is the last one, and it is such a good ending. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.